I watched my ex-husband's new wife adjust the tennis bracelet I'd left behind, the one that used to sit in my jewelry box, the one I'd abandoned because looking at it made me sick, and I realized she had absolutely no idea she'd already lost everything. She stood in the parking lot of the grocery store, designer bag on her arm, clearly relishing this moment. She approached me and said, "Glenn says you're barely getting by. Must be hard, going from everything to this." She gestured at my 10-year-old Subaru. I smiled. Not a big smile, just a small, quiet curve of my lips. "Before we dive into this story, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, wherever you are in the world. And please hit that like button for me right now and subscribe to my channel." We're building a community of people who refuse to be silenced, who know that dignity has no expiration date. Now back to my story. My name is Meredith Hathaway. I'm 57 years old, and I made the classic mistake of letting my ex-husband think he won, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I ended up in that parking lot, smiling at the woman who destroyed my marriage while she had no idea she'd married a financial corpse, you need to know how this whole thing started. You need to understand what Glenn took from me. And more importantly, you need to know what I took back. 2 years ago, I was living what I thought was a good life. Not perfect. No marriage is perfect after 28 years, but good, comfortable. Glenn and I had built something together. He ran his business. I managed our home and our investments. And we existed in that upper middle class bubble where you never really worry about money, but you're also not obscenely wealthy. Country club memberships, charity galas twice a year, vacation homes we rented, not owned. That level. I was 55. Glenn was 58. We had 2 adult children, Rebecca, 32, and Josh, 29. Both out of the house, both building their own lives. We'd done our job as parents. We were supposed to be entering the phase where we traveled more, relaxed, enjoyed the fruits of 3 decades of work and partnership. I actually believed that. I believed we were solid. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 18 months ago. I wasn't snooping. I want to be very clear about that. I wasn't the kind of wife who checked her husband's phone or went through his emails. I trusted Glenn. Completely, stupidly. His phone was on the kitchen counter. He was in the shower. It buzzed with a text message, and the preview appeared on the lock screen. I glanced at it the way you glance at anything that makes noise near you. Casual, unthinking. The message was from someone named Tanya. It said, "Can't wait for tonight. Wear the cologne I like." My brain tried to make it innocent. A work colleague, a friend, something explainable. But my hands were already picking up the phone, already entering his passcode, our anniversary, which felt like a knife in my chest even then, already opening his messages. There were hundreds of texts, months of them. The affair had been going on for at least 8 months, maybe longer. Tanya was his sales manager, 38 years old, divorced, no kids. And from the messages, it was clear this wasn't just sex. They were planning a future. They talked about trips they'd take, houses they'd look at, the life they'd build together once Glenn handled the Meredith situation. That phrase, the Meredith situation, like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. But what made my blood run cold, what made me stand there in my kitchen shaking while the shower ran upstairs, were the messages where they talked about money, about assets, about how Glenn had been preparing for over a year, how he'd moved things around, how I'd never see it coming because I was too comfortable to notice anything. One text from Glenn said, "She handles the household accounts, but she doesn't know anything about the business side. I've been careful. When this is over, she'll get what the court says she deserves, and nothing more." Tanya's response, "You're so smart, baby. She has no idea." I stood there reading these messages, reading about my own betrayal, my own financial destruction, planned out like a business transaction, and something inside me crystallized, something hard and cold and absolutely unbreakable. I took screenshots of everything, texted them to myself, deleted the sent messages from his phone, put it back exactly where he'd left it. When Glenn came downstairs 20 minutes later, hair wet, smiling at me like nothing in the world was wrong, I smiled back. "How was your shower?" I asked. "Good," he said. "Hey, I have to work late tonight. Tanya's having issues with the Morrison account." "Of course," I said. "I'll save you dinner." He kissed my cheek and left. And I sat down at my computer and started researching forensic accountants. Because here's what Glenn didn't understand about me. I might have been comfortable, but I wasn't stupid. I'd been managing our household finances for decades. I knew how money moved. I knew what our accounts should look like. And the moment I started paying attention, really paying attention, I could see the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where numbers didn't quite add up. Glenn had been hiding money for years, maybe longer than the affair. Maybe the affair was just the catalyst for him to accelerate whatever exit strategy he'd been building all along. I didn't confront him. Not then, not for weeks. I let him keep thinking he was in control while I quietly built my case. I hired Catherine Chen, a forensic accountant with a reputation for finding money that didn't want to be found. I told her everything, showed her the texts, gave her access to every document I could find. "Don't tell him you know," Catherine said during our second meeting. "Don't tell anyone. Let him think he's smarter than everyone in the room. Men like Glenn, they get sloppy when they're confident." So I performed. God, did I perform. I was the perfect unsuspecting wife. Made dinners, laughed at his jokes, asked about his day. All while Catherine dug through financial records and started finding things that made her eyebrows raise higher and higher. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell companies with Glenn listed as the beneficial owner, partnership stakes in businesses he'd told me he'd sold years ago. Cryptocurrency purchased with business funds and stored in cold wallets I'd never heard of. Real estate in other states, titled to LLCs with names that meant nothing to me, but everything to someone who knew where to look. "Meredith," Catherine said during our meeting 6 weeks after I'd hired her, "your husband has been systematically moving money out of your reach for at least 3 years, possibly longer. The timeline suggests this started well before the affair." "How much?" I asked. She looked at me with something like pity. "So far, I've found $42 million, and I'm not done looking." $42 million. Money that should have been ours. Money from businesses we'd built together, investments we'd made together, decades of work and partnership. And Glenn had been secretly moving it, hiding it, preparing to leave me with scraps while he rode off into the sunset with his sales manager. I should have been devastated. I should have cried or screamed or thrown things. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, absolutely, perfectly clear about what I needed to do. "Keep looking," I told Catherine. "Find all of it, every dollar, and don't let him know we're coming." The divorce papers arrived at Glenn's office on a Friday afternoon 16 months ago. I'd planned the timing carefully, end of the week, when he'd be tired, when Tanya would probably be there to witness his reaction. I filed through an attorney Glenn didn't know, a lawyer Catherine had recommended, not someone from our social circle, not someone Glenn would expect. He came home that evening and the mask finally came off. No more pretending, no more performance. "You're really doing this?" he said, standing in our living room holding the papers like they were something contaminated. "Yes," I said simply. "Over one mistake?" His voice had that wounded quality, like he was the victim here. "Meredith, I made a mistake. People make mistakes. We can work through this." "You've been planning to leave me for 3 years, Glenn. I saw the texts. I know about Tanya. I know you've been moving money. This isn't a mistake. This is a strategy." His face changed then. The wounded husband disappeared, and something colder took its place. "Fine," he said. "You want to do this the hard way? We'll do it the hard way. But I promise you, Meredith, you're going to regret making this ugly." And he kept that promise. For the next 18 months, Glenn made the divorce as ugly as humanly possible. He dragged out every proceeding, filed endless motions, claimed poverty to the court while taking Tanya on expensive vacations. He told everyone who would listen that I was being vindictive, that I was trying to take everything he'd worked for, that I was a bitter, vengeful woman who couldn't accept that he'd fallen in love with someone else. And people believed him. Our friends, people I'd known for decades, started choosing sides. Most of them chose Glenn, because Glenn was charming, Glenn was persuasive, Glenn played the role of the remorseful man who'd made one mistake and was being punished disproportionately by his cruel wife. I watched my social circle dissolve, watched women I'd had lunch with every week suddenly become too busy to see me, watched couples we'd vacationed with post pictures with Glenn and Tanya. Smiling like this was all perfectly normal and fine. My own children didn't fully understand. Rebecca was sympathetic but kept saying things like, "Mom, maybe you should just settle. This is destroying you." Josh barely spoke to me. He'd always been closer to Glenn. He thought I was embarrassing myself by fighting so hard. The only people who truly understood were Catherine and my new lawyer, Margaret Stern. Margaret was a specialist in high-conflict divorces with hidden assets. She'd seen men like Glenn before, and she was absolutely ruthless. "Let him think he's winning," Margaret advised during one of our strategy sessions. "Let him get comfortable. The more confident he is, the less careful he'll be." So that's what we did. I agreed to a temporary support arrangement that seemed modest. I moved out of our house, the house I decorated, the house where I'd raised my children, and into a rental in a middle-class neighborhood. A nice rental, but nothing like what I was used to. I kept driving my old Subaru. I started shopping at regular stores instead of boutiques. I got my hair cut at a Supercuts instead of the salon I'd been going to for 15 years. I let everyone believe that Glenn had won, that I'd been reduced to barely scraping by while he lived his best life with his younger girlfriend. And while everyone watched me struggle, Catherine kept digging. She found more accounts, more hidden assets, more evidence of Glenn's systematic deception. By the time we were ready to go to court, 14 months after I'd filed, she'd traced $94 million that Glenn had hidden or failed to disclose. $94 million, not 42, 94. "He's been doing this for at least 5 years, Catherine told me. Maybe longer. Some of these accounts were opened before you even suspected anything was wrong. The affair wasn't the beginning. It was just the end of something that had been dying for years. Glenn had been planning his exit long before he'd met Tanya. He'd been building his escape hatch, and I'd been so comfortable, so trusting, that I'd never noticed the foundation crumbling beneath me. The final court hearing happened 4 months ago. Glenn walked in confident. He'd been confident throughout the entire process. His lawyer had assured him that my team had nothing substantial, that I was grasping at straws, that the judge would see through my vindictive claims. Tanya sat in the gallery watching, supporting her man, probably planning their wedding, their future, their life with all that money she thought he still had. Glenn's lawyer presented first, made it sound straightforward. A simple division of marital assets. Glenn had been more than generous with temporary support. He disclosed all his financial information. He just wanted to move on with his life. Then Margaret stood up. "Your Honor," she said, "we have evidence of systematic financial fraud spanning multiple years." She placed the first document on the table. Bank statements from an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, then another, then another. Each piece of evidence a hammer blow to Glenn's carefully constructed lie. I watched his face change, watched the confidence drain away, and something like panic take its place. His lawyer, who clearly hadn't known about any of this, started frantically whispering to him. Asked for a recess. The judge, looking increasingly angry, granted it. When we came back after lunch, Margaret continued. She showed how Glenn had used marital funds to purchase hidden assets, how he'd created shell companies to disguise ownership, how he'd purchased cryptocurrency with business account money, which meant the funds were commingled, which meant they were marital property, how he'd reported false information on tax returns. That last part was key. Because once you involve tax fraud, suddenly the IRS gets interested, and Glenn's problems became much bigger than just losing money in a divorce. The judge's face was stone. "Mr. Hathaway," he said, "you have 30 days to provide complete financial disclosure of all assets, or I will hold you in contempt. And I'm ordering a forensic review of your tax filings for the past 7 years. Glenn's world collapsed in that courtroom. I could see it happening, could see him realizing that he wasn't just losing the divorce. He was potentially facing criminal charges. His lawyer advised him to settle immediately, before things got worse. The final settlement came through 3 months ago, $47 million. Half of what Catherine had found, the house, which I immediately sold for $3.2 million, half his pension, a lump sum for spousal support, all legal fees paid by Glenn. The judgment was sealed at my request. I didn't want publicity, didn't want attention. I just wanted what was mine and the chance to disappear into a life Glenn would never understand. Because here's what Glenn never told Tanya. He was too embarrassed, too humiliated. He couldn't admit to his new fiancée that he'd just lost $47 million because he'd tried to hide it from his wife. He couldn't tell her about the IRS penalties he was facing, the potential criminal investigation, the fact that his net worth had just been cut in half and then carved up again by tax liens. So he lied to her too, told her the case had settled fairly without giving details, continued taking her to nice dinners and buying her gifts, now funded by credit cards instead of cash, by loans instead of investments. He kept up the appearance of wealth while his actual financial situation crumbled beneath him. And Tanya had no idea. She thought she'd won, thought she'd captured the wealthy businessman and secured her future. She married him 2 months ago in an expensive ceremony, wearing an expensive dress, surrounded by people who thought they were celebrating a love story. She had no idea she'd married a man who was now underwater financially, who was scrambling to maintain appearances, who was facing IRS audits and potential penalties that could cost him millions more. When she found me in that parking lot last week, when she made her little speech about how I'd lost everything and she'd won, she genuinely believed it. She looked at my old car and my Target clothes and my grocery store bags, and she saw exactly what I wanted her to see. A woman defeated, struggling, reduced to nothing. What she didn't see was the penthouse I'd purchased through an LLC for $4.5 million. The $40 million sitting in diversified investments. The foundation I was building to help other women who found themselves in my situation. The lawyers and accountants and financial advisors who now worked for me, helping me turn that $47 million into something that would last for generations. I didn't correct her assumptions, didn't tell her the truth. Because the truth is, I don't owe Tanya anything. Not explanations, not confrontation, not even the satisfaction of knowing what she's really married into. I just smiled and drove away in my Subaru, the car I kept because I genuinely like it, because it's reliable and practical and doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, and went home to my real life. The one Glenn will never see. The one Tanya doesn't know exists. At 57 years old, I learned something my younger self would never have believed. The sweetest revenge isn't confrontation. It's not standing in someone's face and making them admit they were wrong. It's not even watching them suffer. Though I won't pretend there isn't some satisfaction in knowing Glenn is finally facing consequences. No. The sweetest revenge is living so well that you forget to care what they think. It's building something so solid, so real, so entirely yours that their opinion becomes irrelevant. It's disappearing into wealth and privacy while they scramble to maintain appearances. Glenn wanted me to disappear quietly into poverty and shame, to be the cautionary tale he could point to, the bitter ex-wife who got what she deserved for not appreciating him. Instead, I disappeared into something he'll never understand: actual freedom. Financial security, purpose, peace, and I'm just getting started. The morning after Catherine Chen told me she'd found $94 million my husband had hidden, I woke up at 3 a.m. and couldn't go back to sleep. Not because I was excited, not because I felt vindicated, but because lying there in the dark of my rental house, this middle-class rental that was supposed to represent my defeat, I realized something terrifying. I was completely alone in this. Everyone I'd trusted, everyone I'd built a life with, had either betrayed me or abandoned me, and the only two people who believed me were women I was paying to believe me. What if we were wrong? What if somehow Glenn found out what we knew? What if this entire strategy collapsed and I ended up with nothing, just like he'd planned? I got up, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table and looked at the spreadsheet Catherine had sent me the night before. $94 million, broken down into accounts and assets and investments I'd never known existed. My husband's secret life, quantified in Excel. The affair had been devastating. But this was something else entirely. This was premeditated, calculated. This was Glenn looking at our marriage, our partnership, our 3 decades together, and deciding I was worth nothing, that I deserved nothing, that he could erase me like I'd never mattered at all. I opened my laptop and started reading through the documents Catherine had compiled, and that's when I saw it, a bank statement from the Cayman Islands, dated 5 years ago. 5 years. 2 years before I'd found the texts. 3 years before Glenn had even met Tanya. He'd been planning this before the affair. The affair wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just another piece of a puzzle he'd been assembling for half a decade. How do you process something like that? How do you sit with the knowledge that someone you loved, someone you built a life with, had been systematically dismantling that life while you slept next to him every night, completely unaware? I called Margaret at 7 a.m. She answered on the second ring. "I need to know something," I said. "Did he ever love me? Or was this always the plan?" There was a pause. Then Margaret said very gently, "Meredith, the man you loved probably did love you at some point. But the man who opened offshore accounts 5 years ago, that's someone else. That's someone who decided his future was more important than your past. And I'm sorry. But we can't prosecute him for that. We can only prosecute him for the money." So that's what we did. We focused on the money. And over the next several months, while Glenn paraded around town with Tanya, while my former friends posted pictures of their dinner parties and vacation trips that no longer included me, Catherine dug deeper into my husband's financial deception. She found shell companies, 3 of them, all registered in Delaware, all listing Glenn as the beneficial owner, all holding assets he'd supposedly sold years ago. There was one called Westridge Holdings, LLC, that owned a commercial property worth $4 million. Glenn had told me he'd sold his stake in that property back in 2018, told me we'd use the money to renovate the house, but the LLC still owned it. Glenn still owned it. The renovation had been paid for with money from somewhere else entirely. "He's been lying about everything," Catherine said during one of our weekly meetings. She had this way of stating devastating facts in the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather. The question is, how far back the lies go? We were sitting in her office, a small cluttered space that smelled like coffee and paper. I'd been meeting with her every Thursday for 3 months. My Thursday therapy sessions, I'd started calling them, though there was nothing therapeutic about learning new ways your husband had betrayed you. "There's something else," Catherine said, pulling up another document on her screen. "Cryptocurrency. He's been purchasing Bitcoin and Ethereum using business funds for the past 4 years. It's all stored in cold wallets, which means it's completely off any official records. I only found it because I traced the business account transactions and noticed regular transfers to a crypto exchange." "How much?" I asked. "At current valuation? About $8 million. But the purchases were made over time, so he probably spent less than that originally. Regardless, it's marital property. He purchased it with business funds, which are commingled with personal funds, which means it all goes in the pot for division. $8 million in cryptocurrency I'd never known about, added to the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the hidden real estate, the partnership stakes he'd lied about selling. My husband had built an entire financial empire in the shadows of our marriage, and I'd had no idea. I'd been paying our bills, managing our household accounts, organizing our charitable donations, living my life thinking I understood our financial situation. While Glenn had been building escape hatches and exit strategies, I'd been planning anniversary dinners. Have you ever felt stupid and brilliant at the same time? Stupid for not seeing what was happening right in front of you, but brilliant for finally figuring it out? That's where I lived for months, in that weird liminal space between self-recrimination and determination. The hardest part wasn't the investigation, it was the isolation. I couldn't tell anyone what we'd found. Margaret was adamant about that. The moment Glenn knows we know, he'll move everything, she said. These accounts, these assets, they're all in places where money can disappear very quickly. We need him to stay confident, comfortable. We need him to think he's already won. So I performed my role, the defeated wife, the woman who'd been outmaneuvered. I showed up to my daughter Rebecca's birthday dinner and smiled while Glenn sat at the other end of the table with Tanya. I ran into former friends at the grocery store and pretended not to notice when they avoided eye contact. I lived in my rental house, drove my old car, wore my Target clothes, and let everyone believe exactly what Glenn wanted them to believe. But at night, alone, I'd sit with Catherine's reports and Margaret's legal strategies, and I'd feel this cold, hard fury building in my chest. Not hot anger, not the kind of rage that makes you scream or throw things. This was something else, something patient, something that could wait as long as it needed to wait. My son Josh called me on a Tuesday evening, about 6 months into the divorce proceedings. We hadn't spoken in weeks. He'd been avoiding me, and I'd been letting him because I didn't have the energy to fight with my own child about whose side he should be on. "Mom," he said, and I could hear the discomfort in his voice. "I think you need to let this go. Dad said you're making this so much harder than it needs to be. He said he's offered you a fair settlement and you keep rejecting it." I sat there on my rental house couch, looking at the IKEA coffee table I'd bought because I couldn't take any of our real furniture, and I wanted to tell him everything. Wanted to explain about the $94 million, the offshore accounts, the systematic deception, the fact that his father had been planning to leave me destitute for years. But I couldn't, because the moment Josh knew, Glenn would know, and everything we'd built would collapse. "Okay," I said instead. "I'll think about it. Thanks, Mom. I think you'd be happier if you could move on, you know? Dad's moved on. Tanya seems nice. Maybe you should try to find that for yourself." After I hung up, I sat there for a long time. My son thought I should be happy his father's mistress was nice. Thought I should move on from a marriage where I'd been systematically robbed. Thought I was the problem because I wasn't making this easy for everyone else. Did I mention that loneliness? That specific kind of loneliness that comes from being the only person who knows the truth? It's different from regular loneliness. It's heavier. It sits in your chest like a stone, and it doesn't go away even when you're talking to people, even when you're busy, even when you're distracted. Because underneath everything else you know, you are utterly alone with this knowledge. Rebecca was better. She at least tried to understand, even if she didn't fully get it. She'd come over to the rental house once a week, bring takeout, sit with me while we ate Chinese food or pizza or whatever was easy. "Are you okay, Mom?" she asked during one of these visits. And I mean really okay, not the version you tell everyone else. I looked at my daughter, 32, successful in her own right, married to a good man who'd never once made me question his character, and I wanted so badly to tell her the truth. "I'm surviving," I said instead. "Some days that's the best I can do." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I don't know what you're going through, but I know Dad's not being honest about something. I can feel it. And I want you to know I'm here, okay? Whatever you need." It wasn't much, but it was something. One person who didn't completely believe Glenn's version of events. One person who thought maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story. Meanwhile, Glenn's victory tour continued. He and Tanya were everywhere, at the country club, at charity events, at restaurants I used to frequent before the divorce made everything awkward. They held hands. They laughed. They posted on social media about new adventures and fresh starts and finding real love, and our former friends ate it up, because Glenn's narrative was so much easier to believe than the truth. A man who made a mistake, fell in love, and was being punished by his bitter ex-wife? That's a story people understand. That's a story with a clear villain and a clear victim. But a man who spent 5 years systematically hiding $94 million from his wife while planning to leave her destitute, that's complicated. That requires people to reconsider everything they thought they knew. That makes them complicit in their ignorance. So they chose the simple story, and I let them. 8 months into the divorce, Margaret called me on a Friday evening. "We have a problem," she said, and my stomach dropped. "Glenn's attorney just filed a motion claiming you're hiding assets. They're requesting a forensic review of your finances." I actually laughed. Couldn't help it. The irony was too perfect. "Let them look," I said. "I've got nothing to hide." "I know that, but it's going to delay everything, and it means Glenn's getting suspicious. He's wondering why you haven't settled yet, why you keep pushing back on his offers." "Because his offers are insulting," I said. "He's offering me $5 million when he's hidden $94 million. That's not a settlement. That's theft with paperwork." "I agree, but he doesn't know we know about the $94 million, and if we're not careful, he's going to figure it out." That night, I lay awake again, running through scenarios. What if Glenn moved the money before we got to court? What if he somehow managed to hide it better? What if I'd come this far, spent all this money on lawyers and accountants, alienated half my social circle and my own son, and ended up with nothing anyway? Have you ever been so close to something you desperately need that the fear of losing it becomes almost paralyzing? That's where I was. Standing on the edge of vindication, terrified I was about to fall, Catherine called the next morning with an update. "I found more," she said. "Real estate in Arizona and Nevada, titled to LLCs we hadn't traced yet. Another $3 million in assets. We're at $97 million now." $97 million. Almost $100 million. My husband had hidden $100 million. "Catherine," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "How? How does someone hide that much money?" "Very carefully," she said, "and over a very long time. Meredith, this isn't opportunistic. This is systematic. He's been planning this for at least 5 years, maybe longer. Every business deal, every investment, every major financial decision. He's been thinking about how to hide it from you." I thought about all those years. All those nights we'd sat together planning our future. All those conversations about retirement, about travel, about what we'd do when we were older. He'd been lying the entire time, looking me in the eye and lying about everything that mattered. "How do I not let this destroy me?" I asked, not Catherine specifically, just the universe in general. "How do I live with knowing someone I loved was capable of this?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You live with it by making sure he doesn't get away with it. That's how you survive this, Meredith. You turn the pain into purpose." So that's what I did. I turned the pain into purpose. The divorce dragged on. Glenn filed motion after motion, delay after delay. His attorney claimed they needed more time to prepare, that my requests for financial disclosure were too broad. That I was being unreasonable. The court granted extension after extension. Our case, which should have been resolved in months, stretched into over a year, and while we waited, while the legal system ground forward at its glacial pace, I had to keep living, had to keep pretending, had to keep showing up to my rental house every night and sitting alone with the knowledge that I'd found $97 million, while everyone thought I was barely surviving. I started having dreams about the courtroom, about the moment when Margaret would present our evidence, and Glenn's face would change from confident to panicked. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, and for a second I wouldn't know if it had really happened or if I'd imagined it. If vindication was real, or if I'd invented it to cope with the reality that I might actually lose, because that was always there, underneath everything else, the possibility that somehow, despite all our evidence, despite Catherine's meticulous work and Margaret's brilliant strategy, Glenn might still win, that the court might not believe us, that the judge might decide the offshore accounts were somehow legitimate business holdings, that the system I was trusting to deliver justice might fail me the way everything else had failed me. My former best friend Diane posted pictures from a dinner party at her house. Glenn and Tanya were there, laughing with people I'd known for 20 years, people who'd been at my wedding, people who'd held my children when they were babies. And now they were raising glasses with my ex-husband and his mistress, celebrating whatever story Glenn had told them about his new life. I looked at those pictures on my phone, because of course I looked, because I couldn't help myself, and I felt something I hadn't felt before, not anger, not even hurt, just this cold, clear understanding that those friendships were never real, that if they'd been real, those people would have asked questions, would have wondered why a marriage of 28 years had exploded so completely, would have considered that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than Glenn's version. But they didn't ask, because asking would have required them to acknowledge their own complicity, their own willingness to believe the easy narrative instead of the complicated truth. So I let them go. All of them. Just mentally released them and moved on. Because I was learning something important. Sometimes the trash takes itself out. Sometimes the betrayal that hurts the most is also the one that shows you exactly who deserves to be in your life. 10 months in, we finally got a court date. The hearing was scheduled for 3 months out. Margaret said it was time to finalize our strategy. We met at her office, me, Margaret, and Catherine. 3 women sitting around a conference table covered in financial documents that represented my husband's systematic deception. He's going to walk in there confident, Margaret said. He thinks his attorney has prepared for everything. He thinks the worst that can happen is he pays you a fair settlement. He has no idea what we've found. What if he figures it out? I asked. What if between now and the hearing, someone tips him off? Then we adapt, Margaret said. But Meredith, I need you to understand something. Even if he moves some of the money, we have documentation of all of it. Once we present evidence of hidden assets, the court can impute income and value based on what we've found. He can't make it disappear at this point. The documentation exists. And the IRS? Catherine asked. When are we reporting the tax fraud? After the hearing, Margaret said. Once our case is resolved. The moment we report it before, it becomes a criminal matter and our divorce case gets frozen pending investigation. We need to get Meredith's settlement first. Then we let the IRS do their job. Tax fraud, criminal investigation. These were words I'd never imagined applying to my husband. Glenn, who'd always been so careful about appearances, so concerned with reputation, who'd served on the board of our local business association, who'd given speeches about ethical business practices. All of it had been a mask. All of it had been covering someone who was willing to commit fraud to keep what he thought was his. The last 3 months before the hearing were the longest of my life. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for Glenn to move the money, for some legal technicality to derail everything, for the universe to intervene and prove that justice was just a nice story we tell ourselves. But nothing went wrong. The date approached. We finalized our presentation. Catherine had 847 pages of documentation. Every hidden asset traced and verified, every transaction documented, every lie exposed in black and white. How do I act in the courtroom? I asked Margaret the week before. Do I look angry? Do I cry? Do I sit there stone-faced? You look like someone who's telling the truth, Margaret said, because that's what you are. Let Glenn do the performing. You just be honest. The night before the hearing, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I sat in my rental house living room, looking at the walls I'd never bothered to decorate because this was supposed to be temporary, because I was supposed to be moving on to whatever came next, and I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The affair, the lies, the hidden money, the isolation, the loneliness, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, wondering if I was strong enough to see this through. The mornings I'd woken up and forced myself to keep going even when every part of me wanted to give up. And I thought about Glenn. probably sleeping peacefully in our old house, the house he'd gotten in the temporary arrangement, the house I'd walked away from because fighting over it seemed pointless when there was so much more at stake. I wondered if he had any idea what was coming, if some part of him suspected, or if he was really so arrogant, so confident in his own intelligence that he believed he'd actually gotten away with it. I guess I was about to find out, because tomorrow, in a courtroom, in front of a judge who didn't know either of us, who had no investment in our story except to apply the law fairly, we were going to present evidence of the biggest betrayal of my life. And Glenn was going to have to sit there and watch his carefully constructed lies fall apart, unless something went wrong, unless somehow, despite everything, he still managed to win. That was the thought I fell asleep with. That was the fear that followed me into my dreams. Not anger at Glenn, not anticipation of victory, just pure, undiluted terror that I'd come this far and was about to lose everything anyway. And tomorrow we'd find out if justice was real or just another lie we tell ourselves to get through the night. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I don't know why that surprised me. Maybe I'd watched too many legal dramas where everything happens in these grand, intimidating spaces with high ceilings and dramatic lighting. But this was just a regular courtroom in a regular courthouse, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the kind of place where ordinary people came to resolve ordinary disputes. Except there was nothing ordinary about what was about to happen. Glenn walked in at exactly 9 a.m., wearing his most expensive suit, the navy one I'd helped him pick out 3 years ago for a business conference. His attorney, Richard Brennan, walked beside him, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They looked confident, relaxed even, like this was just another formality to get through before they could move on with their lives. Tanya wasn't in the courtroom. Glenn had told her not to come, said it would be too stressful. I wondered if part of him knew, on some level, what was about to happen, if some instinct told him to keep her away from the implosion. Margaret sat beside me, perfectly calm. Catherine was in the gallery with her laptop, ready to pull up any document we might need. And me? I was wearing a simple black suit I'd bought at Macy's, the kind of outfit that said, taking this seriously, without saying, trying too hard. No jewelry except my watch, hair pulled back, minimal makeup. I looked exactly like someone who'd been reduced to barely scraping by, which was, of course, exactly the point. The judge entered, Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd heard every possible lie and wasn't interested in hearing any more. She looked at the paperwork in front of her, then at both parties, then said, "Let's begin." Richard Brennan stood first. He was good, I'll give him that. He painted a picture of a straightforward divorce between two people who'd grown apart. He talked about Glenn's business success, his contributions to the community, his willingness to provide fair support despite the acrimonious nature of the proceedings. He made it sound like Glenn was being generous, like I should be grateful for whatever scraps he was offering. "Mr. Hathaway has provided complete financial disclosure," Richard said, and I watched Glenn nod along like this was absolutely true. "He's willing to settle this matter quickly and fairly. It's Mrs. Hathaway who has repeatedly rejected reasonable offers and prolonged these proceedings unnecessarily." Judge Morrison made a note, looked at Margaret. "Counsel?" Margaret stood, and something in the air shifted. She had this way of commanding attention without raising her voice, without any theatrics at all, really. She just stood there, completely still, and said, "Your Honor, we have evidence of systematic financial fraud spanning multiple years." I watched Glenn's face, watched the confusion flicker across it, the moment where he thought maybe he'd heard wrong. Maybe this was some kind of bluff. Margaret placed the first document on the table. Bank statements from offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands opened 5 years ago and never disclosed in any financial documentation provided to opposing counsel. Richard Brennan leaned over to Glenn, whispered something. Glenn shook his head, whispered back, but I could see it in his eyes now, the first crack of understanding. the realization that something had gone very, very wrong. Your Honor, Richard said, standing quickly, we were not made aware of any such allegations. We need time to review. These documents were obtained through legal discovery, Margaret interrupted smoothly. We've provided copies to opposing counsel. They were delivered to their office 3 days ago. That was a lie. We delivered them 3 hours ago. Just enough time for them to arrive before the hearing, but not enough time for Glenn's team to prepare any kind of response. It wasn't exactly playing fair, but then again, nothing about this divorce had been fair from the beginning. Judge Morrison looked at Richard. Have you reviewed these documents? We received them this morning, Your Honor. We haven't had adequate time. Then I suggest you take time now, Judge Morrison said. We'll recess for 2 hours. When we return, I expect both parties to be prepared to discuss these allegations in detail. The gavel came down. Glenn stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. He grabbed Richard's arm, said something I couldn't hear, but I could read his body language. The anger, the panic, the desperate need to understand how this had happened. Margaret turned to me. That went exactly as expected. They'll spend the next 2 hours trying to figure out damage control, but there is no damage control. We have everything. We went to a coffee shop across the street. I couldn't eat, but I ordered coffee just to have something to do with my hands. Catherine pulled up her laptop and started going through the documents we'd present next. The shell companies, the cryptocurrency, the real estate holdings, layer after layer of deception. He's going to try to explain it away, Catherine said. He'll say some of it was for legitimate business purposes, that we're mischaracterizing normal business practices as deception. Can he do that? I asked. He can try, Margaret said, but we've documented everything. The timeline alone is damning. He started moving money the same year he opened that first offshore account, and he never disclosed any of it. Not to you, not to the IRS, not to anyone. That's not business strategy. That's fraud. 2 hours felt like 2 minutes and 2 years at the same time. When we walked back into the courthouse, Glenn looked different. The confidence was gone. His face was pale, his jaw was tight. Tanya had arrived during the break. She was sitting in the gallery now, looking confused and worried. Glenn hadn't even glanced at her. Richard Brennan stood when court resumed. Your Honor, bowed. My client maintains that these accounts represent legitimate business holdings that were inadvertently omitted from disclosure. We're prepared to provide corrected financial statements and work toward an amended settlement agreement. Inadvertently omitted, Margaret repeated, her voice carrying just enough skepticism to make the words sound absurd. Your Honor, may I present the timeline? She pulled up a screen, projected it so everyone could see. A simple timeline showing when accounts were opened, when money was moved, when Glenn had signed disclosure documents swearing he'd revealed all assets. These omissions weren't inadvertent, Margaret said. They were systematic, deliberate, and they spanned 5 years. Every time Mr. Hathaway signed a disclosure document, he was committing fraud, not just against his wife, but against this court. Judge Morrison's expression hadn't changed, but something in her eyes had gone very cold. Mr. Hathaway, do you have an explanation for why none of these accounts appeared in your financial disclosures? Glenn stood. For a moment I thought he might actually tell the truth, might admit what he'd done and beg for mercy. But old habits die hard. Your Honor, I believed these were business assets, separate from marital property. My attorney advised. Don't, Richard Brennan said quietly. But Glenn was already committed. That business holdings didn't need to be disclosed in the same way personal assets did. I was following advice. I wasn't trying to hide anything. So your position is that your attorney advised you to commit perjury, Judge Morrison asked, and the temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Richard Brennan closed his eyes briefly. Glenn seemed to realize finally that he'd just thrown his own attorney under the bus, while also admitting to lying under oath. That's not what I meant, Glenn stammered. We also have evidence of tax fraud, Margaret continued, and I could see Glenn physically flinch. Unreported income from these offshore accounts. cryptocurrency purchases made with business funds but never reported as income, real estate holdings that generated rental income never declared to the IRS. She paused. Let that sink in. Then she said very quietly, "This isn't a case of poor record-keeping, Your Honor. This is a case of a man who spent 5 years building a financial fortress designed specifically to ensure his wife would be left with nothing while he disappeared into wealth. And he did it while lying to this court, to the IRS, and to the woman he'd promised to share his life with." The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, just staring at Glenn like he was something that had crawled out from under a rock. Judge Morrison looked at the documents in front of her, then at Glenn, then at Richard Brennan, who looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else. "This case requires additional review," she said finally. "Mr. Hathaway, you have 30 days to provide complete financial disclosure of all assets, domestic and foreign, and I mean complete. If I find out you've hidden so much as a savings account, I will hold you in contempt. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor," Glenn said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Furthermore, I'm ordering a forensic review of your tax filings for the past 7 years, and I'm notifying the IRS of potential fraud. This court takes perjury very seriously, Mr. Hathaway. Very seriously indeed." The gavel came down again. Court was adjourned. Glenn sat there like he'd been physically struck. Tanya was crying in the gallery, though I don't think she understood why yet. Richard Brennan was packing his briefcase with sharp, angry movements. And me? I walked out of that courtroom with Margaret and Catherine beside me, and for the first time in 18 months, I felt like I could breathe. The settlement came through 3 weeks later. Glenn's attorney called Margaret and said they wanted to settle immediately, before the IRS investigation went any further, before the criminal charges that were starting to look inevitable. $47 million. Half of everything Catherine had found. The house, which I sold immediately because I never wanted to see it again. Half his pension. A lump sum for spousal support that would have been laughable if I wasn't so tired of fighting. All legal fees paid by Glenn, and the judgment sealed at my request, because I didn't want publicity, didn't want my face on the news, didn't want to be the woman who took her husband for millions. I just wanted what was mine and the freedom to disappear. Glenn never told Tanya the truth. I know this because 3 months later, I ran into her in that parking lot. 3 months after the settlement. 3 months after I'd taken $47 million and started building a completely new life, and she had no idea. She thought she'd won, thought she'd captured the wealthy businessman, thought I was the one struggling while she lived in luxury. She had no idea she'd married a man who was now drowning in debt, who was facing IRS penalties that would cost him millions more, who was desperately trying to maintain appearances with money he no longer had. And I didn't tell her. Why would I? Let her figure it out on her own. Let her wake up one morning and realize the life she thought she'd stolen was actually just an expensive illusion. Let her live with the consequences of marrying a man who was willing to destroy his wife to get what he wanted. Because here's what I learned through all of this. Revenge isn't about confrontation. It's not about standing in someone's face and making them admit they were wrong. Real revenge, the kind that actually matters, is about building something so solid, so completely yours, that their opinion becomes irrelevant. I bought a penthouse, not in my name, but through an LLC that couldn't be traced back to me. I invested $40 million in a diversified portfolio that generates enough passive income to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I kept $2.5 million liquid to start a foundation for women going through divorces with hidden assets, women who don't have the resources I had, women who are facing the same systematic deception, but don't know how to fight back. The Second Act Foundation. That's what I called it, because I'm 57 years old, and this is my second act. The one where I get to decide what matters. The one where I use what happened to me to help other women survive what's happening to them. I still drive that Subaru, still shop at regular grocery stores, still wear jeans and comfortable sweaters more often than designer clothes, not because I have to anymore, but because I want to, because I learned something valuable about the difference between wealth and the performance of wealth, about what actually matters and what's just expensive noise. My daughter Rebecca knows the truth now. I told her everything after the settlement came through. She cried, apologized for not understanding sooner, said she should have known something was wrong. I told her it wasn't her job to know, that Glenn had fooled everyone, including me, for years, that she had nothing to apologize for. My son Josh still doesn't speak to me much. He's angry that I took so much from his father. He doesn't know about the 97 million Glenn hid, doesn't know about the years of planning and deception, just knows that his dad is struggling now and his mom has more than she needs. Maybe someday he'll understand. Maybe he won't. Either way, I'm learning to be okay with it. As for Glenn, last I heard, he's working again. Actually working, not just pretending to work while living off hidden investments. The IRS penalties hit him hard. The legal fees nearly destroyed him. He's not destitute. Let's be clear about that. He still has millions, but he's not the man he pretended to be. Not anymore. And Tanya? She stayed. That surprised me, honestly. I thought for sure once she figured out the truth, once she realized what she'd actually married into, she'd leave. But she stayed. Maybe because she loves him. Maybe because leaving would mean admitting she was wrong. Maybe because she's already invested too much to walk away now. I don't know. And the truth is, I don't really care anymore. Because I learned something at 57 that I wish I'd known at 27. Your peace is worth more than anyone's version of your story. Your freedom is worth more than their understanding. Your truth is worth more than their approval. Glenn wanted me to disappear into poverty and shame, to be the cautionary tale he could point to, the bitter ex-wife who got what she deserved for not appreciating him. Instead, I disappeared into something he'll never understand: actual freedom, financial security, purpose, peace. And I'm just getting started. So here's my question for you. And I really want you to think about this. When was the last time you let someone underestimate you? When was the last time you let someone think they'd won while you quietly built something they couldn't even imagine? Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't proving someone wrong to their face. Sometimes it's just living so well that their opinion stops mattering at all. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever let someone think they won while you were playing a completely different game? I want to hear your stories. I want to know I'm not the only one who learned that patience and strategy beat rage and confrontation every single time. And if this story resonated with you, if you needed to hear that it's possible to survive betrayal and come out stronger on the other side, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because I'm going to keep telling stories about people who refuse to stay down, about people who turned their pain into power, about people who learned that the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just living a life so full and so completely yours that the people who tried to destroy you become footnotes in a story that's really about something much bigger: your survival, your strength, your refusal to let anyone else write your ending. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's going through their own battle right now, someone who's wondering if it's worth fighting back or if they should just accept what they're being offered and move on. Tell them Meredith's story. Tell them it's possible. Tell them 47 million reasons why patience matters, because at the end of the day, this isn't just my story. It's the story of anyone who's ever been betrayed, underestimated, or written off. It's the story of survival. And I'm living proof that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win. Now go out there and build your own second act. Make it so good that the people who tried to destroy you have to watch from the sidelines while you thrive. And when they finally figure out what you built while they weren't paying attention, just smile and keep moving forward. Because revenge is a dish best served while you're too busy living well to even remember why you wanted it in the first place. Thank you for listening to my story.